How far would you go to find love? How much of yourself would you give to someone who promised to heal your wounds and make you whole again? For Margaret Haynes, love wasn't just a hope, it was a lifeline. But when you hand someone your heart, what happens if they crush it and take everything else with them? This is the story of a woman whose search for connection unraveled into a nightmare. Margaret Haynes had always believed she would grow old with her husband, Alan. For 30 years, he had been her rock, her partner, and her best friend. But when cancer claimed him 5 years ago, it left her alone in the world. Her adult children, busy with their lives, called occasionally, but the silence in her home grew heavier with each passing year. Margaret filled her days with gardening, volunteering, and reading romance novels. But nothing could fill the void Alan had left. It wasn't that she wanted to replace him. She just wanted someone to talk to, someone who would see her for who she was. She longed for the warmth of companionship, the thrill of connection. Only 5% of those who watch my videos are subscribed. If you are enjoying my contents, please subscribe, as this helps me a lot. Thank you, and enjoy this video. Robert Steele's profile was everything Margaret had imagined her ideal match to be. A handsome, black-haired man in his early 40s, piercing blue eyes. He described himself as an entrepreneur who had built his own construction business from the ground up. He loved traveling, fine dining, and long walks on the beach. He was a widower, too, with 2 grown sons who lived abroad. His words were thoughtful, his compliments subtle but genuine. They began exchanging messages, then emails, then long phone calls. Margaret found herself waiting eagerly for his texts, smiling at his jokes, and losing hours in their conversations. Robert shared stories about his late wife, his struggles in building his business, and his plans to retire soon so he could enjoy life to the fullest. He made her feel special, cherished even, in a way she hadn't felt in years. Soon, Robert began calling her Maggie, a nickname only Alan had ever used. It caught her off guard at first, but it felt so natural coming from him. He often told her how he admired her strength and resilience. "You're a rare gem, Maggie," he said one evening. "Women like you don't come around often. I'm lucky to have found you." For Margaret, the loneliness that had once consumed her began to fade. She started dressing up for their video calls, laughing more, and even entertaining the possibility of love again. Her friends noticed the change in her, teasing her about her online boyfriend. "Just be careful," Irene warned her during one of their coffee dates. "The internet can be a dangerous place." Margaret waved off her concerns. "Elaine, I've been around long enough to know when someone's genuine. Robert isn't like those creeps you hear about on the news. He's real." But Robert was also elusive. He lived across the country, he said, managing multiple projects. He had meetings to attend, clients to please, and employees to supervise. Every time Margaret suggested they meet in person, there was an excuse. "Soon, Maggie," he promised. "I just need to wrap up a few things first. Then we'll have all the time in the world." Margaret believed him. How could she not? He had become her confidant, her partner in late-night conversations, the man who reminded her that she was still beautiful, still worthy of love. When Robert mentioned a financial setback with one of his projects, Margaret didn't hesitate to offer help. "It's just a temporary loan," he assured her. "I'll pay you back as soon as my account's clear." Trusting him completely, Margaret transferred the money without a second thought. It started with $5,000, then $10,000, and eventually it added up to her entire savings, $97,000. After all, Robert had promised her a future together, and Margaret was ready to risk everything for love. Little did she know, she wasn't risking her money, she was risking her life. What do you do when the dream you've clung to dissolves before your eyes? How do you pick up the pieces when the person you trusted most becomes a ghost? For Margaret Haynes, the answer wasn't clear, at least not yet. Margaret sat by the window, watching the late afternoon sun cast golden streaks across her lawn. She had set the table with her finest china and lit the scented candles she'd saved for a special occasion. Today was the day. After months of anticipation, Robert Steele was finally coming to visit. Her heart fluttered as she imagined their first embrace, his arms wrapping around her as he whispered, "Maggie, I'm home." She had replayed this moment in her mind endlessly, rehearsing what she would wear, what she would say. She smoothed her blouse nervously and glanced at the clock, 4:15 p.m. Robert's flight was supposed to land at 2:30 p.m., and the drive from the airport wouldn't take more than an hour. Margaret told herself he might have gotten stuck in traffic or lost his phone signal. She tried calling him. No answer. She sent a text. "Everything okay?" No reply. By 8 p.m., the candles had melted into pools of wax, the food had grown cold, and the optimism in Margaret's chest had withered into anxiety. She called the airline, hoping to confirm he had boarded his flight. The agent on the other end of the line informed her there was no record of a Robert Steele on the passenger list. Margaret's stomach churned. "That can't be right," she stammered. "Maybe he used another name." But deep down, she knew something was wrong. The next morning, her worry turned to panic. She called Robert repeatedly, her messages growing increasingly frantic. "Robert, please call me. I'm so worried." Hours turned into days, and Margaret's once lively spirit dimmed with each unanswered call. Finally, a single email appeared in her inbox. Subject: "Goodbye. Maggie, I'm sorry, but I can't do this anymore. Things have become too complicated and I need to move on. Please don't contact me again. I wish you all the best." Margaret stared at the screen, her hands trembling. The words felt like a slap across the face. I can't do this anymore? What did that even mean? He had told her he loved her, that they were building a future together. She reread the email a dozen times, hoping to find some hidden meaning that would make sense of it all. The next week passed in a haze. Margaret barely ate or slept, replaying every conversation, every promise. How had things gone so wrong? She was too ashamed to tell Irene or anyone else. Admitting the truth meant admitting she had been foolish enough to trust him. Her bank statement arrived in the mail one morning, a cruel reminder of the money she had sent him. $97,000 gone. Her life savings. The nest egg she and Alan had built together, meant to carry her through retirement, vanished in a matter of months. She felt sick. Desperate for answers, Margaret turned to her computer. She searched for Robert Steele online, hoping to find some trace of him, a business listing, a social media account, anything. But the more she looked, the more she realized how little she truly knew about him. His stories didn't add up. The business he claimed to own didn't exist. The photos on his dating profile weren't his. That's when the truth hit her like a freight train. Robert Steele wasn't real. Margaret stumbled back from her desk, her mind racing. She had been scammed, duped, played for a fool. The realization brought a wave of emotions: rage, humiliation, heartbreak. How could she have been so blind? Summoning what little strength she had left, Margaret called the police. The detective she spoke to listened patiently as she recounted her story, but his tone was anything but hopeful. "Unfortunately, this happens more often than you'd think," he said. "These scammers are professionals. They know how to cover their tracks." Margaret's chest tightened. "But what about my money? Can you help me get it back?" The detective sighed. "We'll do what we can, but cases like this are tough to crack. A lot of these guys operate from overseas, using fake identities. It's like chasing a ghost." The call ended, leaving Margaret feeling more alone than ever. She wanted to cry, but the tears wouldn't come. Instead, a different emotion began to rise within her, a smoldering anger that made her pulse quicken. She stood in front of her bathroom mirror that night, staring at her reflection. Gone was the hopeful woman who had waited by the window with candles and fine china. In her place was someone new. Someone who had been hurt, humiliated, and betrayed. Margaret clenched her fists, her jaw tightening. She wouldn't let him get away with this. What would you do if the person you trusted most ripped your world apart? Would you crumble? Or would you rise from the ashes, driven by a need for justice or revenge? Margaret Haynes was no longer the victim. She was a woman on a mission. Margaret sat at her kitchen table, her laptop open in front of her. The mug of coffee beside her had gone cold hours ago, untouched. Her once cozy home, filled with sunlight and the smell of fresh flowers, now felt suffocating and dim. She hadn't slept properly in days, but adrenaline kept her awake. She had been scammed, yes, but Margaret wasn't going to let it end there. Somewhere out there, Robert, or whoever he was living his life, enjoying the money he had stolen from her. That thought ignited a fire inside her, burning away the shame and self-pity that had initially consumed her. Her first step was going back to the email Robert had sent, the cold goodbye that had shattered her world. She scrolled through their months of correspondence, searching for clues she had missed. He had mentioned a project in Florida, a business partner named Greg, and an office in Miami. Margaret began writing these details down one by one. Next, she scoured his photos. She ran his profile picture through a reverse image search. Her heart sank when the results confirmed what she already suspected. The photos belonged to a retired model whose images had been stolen and plastered across fake dating accounts worldwide. Robert Steele was a complete fabrication. But Margaret wasn't deterred. If Robert wasn't real, then who was the man behind the mask? She analyzed their conversations, focusing on the little details he had let slip. His love of whiskey, his knowledge of poker, the way he referred to his supposed business dealings. One detail stood out, a slip he made during a phone call weeks ago when he mentioned a great little bar in Tampa. Tampa, she muttered to herself. It was the first real lead she had. Margaret started researching Tampa bars, focusing on upscale places where someone like Robert, or the con artist behind him, might hang out. She cross-referenced their websites and social media accounts, searching for photos of patrons, events, or employees. It was tedious work, but Margaret's determination kept her going, and she stumbled upon a tagged photo on an Instagram account for a popular Tampa lounge. The man in the picture was laughing, holding a glass of whiskey, his arm draped around a young woman. Margaret's stomach flipped. It was him, but he wasn't Robert Steele. The photo's caption identified him as Kevin Bridges. Margaret's hands trembled as she typed his name into a search engine. What she found left her both stunned and enraged. Kevin Bridges had a criminal record, a history of fraud charges spanning over a decade. He had been arrested twice, but released on technicalities both times. Local news articles described him as a notorious scam artist, with victims across multiple states. Margaret leaned back in her chair, her mind reeling. Kevin Bridges wasn't just a con artist. He was a predator, someone who thrived on preying upon the vulnerable. And she wasn't his first victim. She printed out everything she could find, his mugshots, news clippings, and photos from social media. She read forums where other victims shared their stories. Women who had lost not only their savings but also their dignity and trust in the world. Each account fueled Margaret's anger, solidifying her resolve. The police might have written off her case, but Margaret refused to be another name on Kevin Bridges' list of conquests. She mapped out her next steps carefully. Kevin's presence in the Tampa photo suggested he was still in Florida. Margaret decided she would go there herself. She wanted to see him face to face, to confront the man who had stolen everything from her. But this wasn't just about confrontation anymore. Margaret wanted more. She wanted to make him pay. She booked a one-way ticket to Tampa and packed a small suitcase. Standing in front of her bedroom mirror, she took a deep breath. The woman staring back at her was no longer meek or uncertain. She was focused, unrelenting, and ready to face whatever came next. As she zipped up her suitcase, Margaret whispered to herself, "You messed with the wrong woman, Kevin." What happens when the hunter becomes the hunted? When the victim refuses to stay silent? Margaret Haynes was no longer just a grieving widow. She was a woman determined to uncover the truth. And in doing so, she would force Kevin Bridges to confront the chaos he created. The plane ride to Tampa was uneventful, but Margaret's mind was anything but calm. She knew she replayed every detail she'd learned about Kevin Bridges, every inconsistency in his stories, and every lie she'd fallen for. Her anger simmered just below the surface, but she forced herself to focus. This wasn't the time for rash decisions. If she wanted justice, or vengeance, she needed a plan. Margaret rented a modest motel room on the outskirts of Tampa. It was far from the bright, lively areas Kevin frequented, but that suited her just fine. She wasn't here for luxury. She was here to track him down. The first thing she did was lay out her evidence wall, taping printed photos, maps, and notes across the cheap floral wallpaper. Kevin's face stared back at her from multiple angles, his smirk taunting her. She began by visiting the bar where she'd found his photo. Dressed in a nondescript outfit, a plain blouse, jeans, and sunglasses, Margaret slid into a corner seat and ordered a drink. Her eyes scanned the room, searching for any sign of Kevin. Hours passed, and he didn't show. But Margaret wasn't discouraged. She struck up a conversation with a bartender, a young man named Jake, pretending to be a casual traveler. "This place is amazing," she said with feigned enthusiasm. "I heard a lot of regulars hang out here. Must be a great crowd." Jake grinned. "Yeah, we get all kinds. Some faces you see every night, you know?" Margaret leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "I think I recognize someone from here. Old guy, real charming. His name's Kevin, I think." "Does he come by often?" Jake frowned, his brows knitting together. "Kevin? Oh, yeah, I know who you're talking about. He's here sometimes, but not as much lately. Kind of a shady guy, if you ask me." Margaret's heart raced. She pressed on carefully. "Shady? How so?" Jake shrugged. "Just a vibe, you know? He's always flashing cash, talking big, but something about him doesn't add up. Last I heard, he's been hanging around that new poker lounge a few blocks over." Margaret nodded, making a mental note. "Thanks. Guess it's a small world." Over the next few days, Margaret followed the breadcrumbs, inching closer to Kevin's orbit. She visited the poker lounge Jake had mentioned, this time dressed in a sleek black dress and red lipstick to blend into the upscale crowd. She spotted Kevin almost immediately, seated at a corner table with a group of men. Her breath hitched as she saw him in person for the first time. He looked exactly like the photos she'd studied, but there was something more menacing about him in real life. His smile was sharp, his laugh too loud, his confidence unshakable. Margaret didn't approach him that night. Instead, she stayed in the background, observing. She noted how he interacted with others, how he carried himself, and the subtle arrogance in his demeanor. Back in her motel room, Margaret began piecing together a plan. She wouldn't just confront Kevin, she would get him to admit everything. But to do that, she needed to get close to him without revealing her true identity. The next day, she returned to the poker lounge, this time sitting closer to Kevin's table. She made sure to catch his eye, offering him a polite but lingering smile. It didn't take long for Kevin to approach her. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, flashing the same charming grin he'd used to disarm her months ago. Margaret smiled back, hiding the storm inside her. "Not at all. I could use some company." They exchanged pleasantries, Kevin clearly enjoying the attention. Margaret introduced herself under a fake name, Lydia, and fabricated a story about being a recently divorced woman traveling to rediscover herself. Kevin ate it up, his charm in full force. As they spoke, Margaret's hatred for him grew. Every smile, every laugh, every word reminded her of how he had deceived her. But she kept her composure, playing the part of an intrigued stranger. By the end of the evening, Kevin offered to take her out for dinner the next night. Margaret accepted, masking her triumph with a coy smile. She was in his orbit now, and soon she would bring him down. What happens when the predator doesn't realize he's stepped into a trap? As Kevin Bridges basked in his own arrogance, he failed to see the carefully laid snare. Margaret Haynes wasn't just playing along, she was playing to win. Margaret sat at an outdoor table at an elegant bistro in Tampa, the evening breeze carrying the scent of fresh herbs and sea salt. She wore a simple yet flattering dress, her hair styled to look effortlessly casual. Across from her sat Kevin, oozing confidence as he recounted stories of his supposed business triumphs. "And that's how I turned a failing construction company into $1 million operation," Kevin said, leaning back in his chair. Margaret tilted her head, feigning admiration. "Wow, Kevin, you're really something. I can't imagine juggling so much responsibility." He grinned. "It's all about vision, Lydia. You have to see opportunities where others see problems. That's the secret." Margaret forced a smile, biting back her disgust. Every word out of his mouth was a lie, but she played along, nodding in all the right places. She needed him to feel at ease, to believe he was in control. As the dinner progressed, Kevin shifted the conversation to her. "So, tell me about yourself, Lydia. What brings you to Tampa?" Margaret sipped her wine, her carefully crafted story ready. "I just needed a fresh start. After my divorce, I realized I'd spent so much of my life focused on others that I didn't even know who I was anymore. I thought some time away might help me figure that out." Kevin's eyes sparkled with interest. "A fresh start, huh? I like that. You seem like someone who deserves something good for a change." Margaret felt a surge of anger at his audacity, but kept her face composed. "Thanks, Kevin. That means a lot." As the evening wore on, Kevin grew more comfortable, his natural arrogance surfacing. He began dropping hints about his connections, subtly boasting about his wealth and lifestyle. Margaret played her part perfectly, asking just enough questions to keep him talking. When the check arrived, Kevin insisted on paying, flashing a wad of cash as he waved down the waiter. "You're with me now, Lydia. Don't worry about a thing." Margaret smiled, her mind racing. This was the man who had stolen her life savings, flaunting money as if it were nothing. Her resolve hardened. Later that evening, Kevin walked her back to her motel. He lingered by her door, his charm dialed up to its highest setting. "I had a great time tonight," he said, his voice low and smooth. "So did I," Margaret replied, her smile barely concealing the storm beneath. Kevin reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I feel like we really connect, Lydia. Like this was meant to happen." She didn't flinch. "I feel the same way, Kevin." As he leaned in, she stepped back slightly, her hand resting on the doorknob. "Good night, Kevin," she said softly, opening the door and slipping inside before he could respond. Once the door was locked, Margaret leaned against it, exhaling deeply. She felt a pang of guilt for leading him on, but it was quickly drowned out by her anger and determination. Kevin Bridges had stolen everything from her, and she wasn't about to let him get away with it. The next morning, Margaret began laying the groundwork for her plan. She visited the poker lounge where she had first spotted Kevin, ingratiating herself with the regulars. She listened carefully to their conversations, piecing together details about Kevin's habits and movements. She learned that he frequented a high-stakes poker game held in the back room of a nearby club, where he often bragged about his investments and charmed his way into the wallets of unsuspecting players. Margaret decided this was her chance to strike. She returned to the club that evening, wearing a sleek black dress and carrying a small notebook in her purse. She made sure to catch Kevin's eye as she entered, offering him a shy smile. He waved her over immediately, clearly pleased to see her. "Lydia, you're just in time. I was about to head into a game. Want to join me for a drink first?" Margaret hesitated, feigning uncertainty. Kevin laughed, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Don't worry, sweetheart. You can watch and learn. Stick with me and I'll show you how it's done." Margaret nodded, her pulse quickening. "Okay, lead the way." In the dimly lit back room, Margaret sat quietly at Kevin's side, pretending to be impressed by his every move. As the game progressed, she noted how he manipulated the other players, charming them with jokes and feigned camaraderie. He let the game go long enough without being manipulated that they determined it was no longer about whether he was right or wrong, just charming them. It was a performance she knew all too well. Margaret smiled, her mind already calculating her next move. She would let him believe he had her under his spell, let him feel invincible, and when the time was right, she would tear his world apart. Margaret continued to weave herself deeper into Kevin's world. She became his confidant, his biggest admirer, and, to him, the perfect mark. Kevin reveled in her attention, sharing glimpses of his business ventures and even bragging about the women he'd helped in the past, thinly veiled references to his previous victims. "You wouldn't believe how naive some people are," he said one evening over dinner, grinning as he swirled his whiskey. "They hand over their money thinking I'll save them, and I walk away. It's not my fault they're too trusting." Margaret forced a laugh, even as her nails dug into her palm beneath the table. Every word out of his mouth solidified her resolve. She carefully steered the conversation toward his current schemes, feigning interest in his business dealings. Bit by bit, Kevin began revealing details: his favorite haunts, his financial habits, even the people he worked with. Margaret kept meticulous notes, documenting everything she learned. She created a timeline of his activities and identified key players in his operation. Her research became an obsession, her motel room covered in maps, photographs, and handwritten notes. Margaret knew she needed evidence to bring Kevin down, but she also wanted to ensure he felt the same humiliation and betrayal he had inflicted on her. She devised a plan that required precision and nerves of steel. Using the information she'd gathered, Margaret created a fake investment opportunity, a fictional company specializing in high-yield ventures. She designed a professional-looking website and fabricated glowing testimonials from clients. Posing as a wealthy investor under a pseudonym, she reached out to Kevin through a mutual contact she'd befriended at the poker lounge. Kevin took the bait almost immediately. The allure of easy money was too much for him to resist. He arranged a meeting with Margaret's fictional investor, unaware that it was Margaret herself pulling the strings. To ensure her plan succeeded, Margaret also contacted some of Kevin's past victims. She found them through online forums and support groups, persuading several women to share their stories and join her cause. Armed with their testimonies, Margaret knew she could build a case against him. The meeting was set at a high-end hotel, where Margaret played the role of the investor's assistant. She wore a sharp suit, her demeanor cold and professional. Kevin didn't recognize her at first. Her transformation was too complete. "Mr. Bridges," she said, extending a hand, "it's a pleasure to meet you." Kevin flashed his trademark grin. "The pleasure's all mine." As the meeting progressed, Margaret subtly guided the conversation, leading Kevin into a trap. She recorded everything: his claims about his fraudulent businesses, his boasts about manipulating clients, and his casual references to the money he'd stolen. When the moment was right, Margaret dropped the act. "Kevin," she said, leaning forward, "do you remember me?" Kevin frowned, his confidence wavering. "I'm sorry, have we met?" Margaret smirked, pulling out a photo of herself from their first video call. "You knew me as Margaret Haynes. Or maybe you don't remember your victims by name." Kevin's face drained of color. "Margaret, Save it," she snapped, her voice icy. "I've spent months gathering evidence against you. I've spoken to your other victims. I've documented everything. You're done, Kevin." Kevin's charm crumbled, replaced by panic. "We can work something out," he stammered. "I can pay you back." "Pay me back?" Margaret laughed bitterly. "This isn't about the money anymore. It's about making sure you never do this to anyone else. Some say revenge is a dish best served cold, but Margaret Haynes knew that hers would burn with the fire of everything she'd lost. Kevin Bridges had stolen her life, and now she would take his. The room was silent, except for Kevin's muffled cries. He was tied to a chair in Margaret's motel room, his hands and feet bound with duct tape. Sweat dripped down his face, mixing with the blood from a gash on his temple where Margaret had struck him during their confrontation at the hotel. Margaret sat across from him, eerily calm, a serrated knife glinting in her hand. The once timid widow was gone, replaced by a woman who had nothing left to lose. "Do you know how long I've been planning this?" Margaret asked, her voice steady and quiet. Kevin whimpered, his eyes darting around the room, searching for a way out. Margaret leaned forward, her expression unreadable. "Months, Kevin. I've been living with your lies, your betrayal, and the weight of what you took from me. You didn't just steal my money, you stole my dignity, my sense of self, my hope." She stood, pacing the room. "But you didn't count on one thing. I don't give up." Kevin tried to speak, but the cloth gag muffled his words. Margaret pulled it down roughly, her movements devoid of compassion. "Margaret," Kevin sputtered, his voice shaking. "I'm sorry, I'll give you the money back, all of it, I swear, just let me go." Margaret chuckled darkly. "Money? You think this is about money now? You ruined lives, Kevin, mine and countless others. This isn't about restitution. She picked up a small bottle from the table, a bottle of chloroform she'd bought in preparation. Kevin's protests turned into frantic screams as she soaped a rag and pressed it to his face. His struggles weakened, his body going limp. When Kevin awoke, he was lying on a plastic tarp in the middle of the room. Margaret stood over him, wearing rubber gloves and a raincoat. Her expression was emotionless, her eyes cold and calculating. "I want you to know something," Margaret said, her voice devoid of the warmth it once held. "I never wanted to be this person." "You made me!" Kevin screamed, thrashing against his restraints, but Margaret was prepared. She worked methodically, ignoring his pleas. She started with his hands, using a saw she had purchased earlier in the week. The sound of the blade cutting through bone was sickening, but Margaret didn't flinch. Her movements were precise, her focus unwavering. Kevin's screams echoed through the room, growing weaker as blood pooled around him. Margaret worked quickly, using bleach and garbage bags to contain the mess. She'd researched disposal methods thoroughly, reading articles and watching videos on how to avoid detection. By the time she was finished, Kevin's body was in several pieces, each wrapped tightly in plastic. Margaret cleaned the room meticulously, scrubbing every surface and disposing of the tools. She packed the remains into a large duffel bag, her hands steady despite the gravity of what she'd done. Under the cover of darkness, Margaret drove to a remote swamp she'd scouted earlier. The air was thick with the smell of decaying vegetation, the perfect place to ensure Kevin would never be found. One by one, she sank the bags into the murky water, weighing them down with cinder blocks. The swamp swallowed them whole, erasing any trace of Kevin Bridges from existence. She felt no relief, no satisfaction, only an emptiness that stretched into the night. "This is over," she whispered to herself. "He can't hurt anyone anymore." Margaret returned to her motel room, scrubbing herself clean in the shower until her skin was raw. She burned Kevin's personal belongings in a small bonfire behind the building, ensuring no evidence tied her to his disappearance. In the weeks that followed, Margaret moved carefully. She kept her head down, avoiding attention while tying up loose ends. She sent anonymous letters to the women she'd spoken to, urging them to move forward with their lives, promising them that Kevin Bridges was gone for good. But Margaret knew she couldn't stay in Tampa. The memories were too fresh, the risk of discovery too great. For months, Margaret drifted from town to town, blending into the background. She found solace in small acts of kindness, helping strangers, volunteering at shelters, and rebuilding her sense of purpose. Though the weight of what she'd done never left her, she refused to let it define her. One evening, as she watched the sunset from a quiet beach, Margaret allowed herself a rare moment of peace. She had been broken, betrayed, and pushed to the brink, but she had survived. In her pocket, she carried a small notebook, a journal filled with the names and stories of Kevin's victims. It was a reminder of why she had done what she did, and a symbol of her determination to never let anyone take advantage of her again. Margaret Haynes had been a victim once, but now she was something more. She was a survivor, a fighter, and a woman who had reclaimed her life no matter the cost. And though the darkness would always be a part of her, she had found the strength to live in the light. If you enjoyed this dive into the mystery, don't forget to subscribe to True Crime OCS for more chilling stories from history's darkest corners. Drop your thoughts, theories, and questions in the comments below. Let's untangle the truth together. Until next time, stay curious and stay safe.